to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
Great. Matt Hawkins, welcome back.
Thanks, Kent. Good to be here.
Hey,
Thanks for having me back.
It's a privilege. So one of the interesting things about this podcast is this is Monday, November the 2nd, right, Andrew? It's the 2nd? And this is going to come out Friday. So it's going to come out Friday, what is that, November the 4th, 5th? 5th or 6th?
6th.
Okay.
Yeah.
By the way, happy birthday, Dad.
Who?
My dad's birthday is today.
Oh, really?
Oh, nice.
Oh, your dad? What's his first name?
Kyle.
Kyle Christenberry.
Mine's the 5th.
Happy birthday, Kyle.
Oh,
go
happy
November
birthday.
birthdays.
Yeah,
absolutely.
go November birthdays.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, for sure. Well, my daughter's is November the 4th. And yeah, it's great.
Birthday week.
Absolutely. So this is it's interesting because we're having this conversation on Monday. Election day obviously is tomorrow, but the podcast doesn't come out till Friday. So, but on that note, let me start out with kind of your general thoughts on the election, but I'm also curious, when do you think we're going to know who is going to be president? We have this fun dynamic where people are going to be able to do some time travel and to see how accurate some of your thoughts were, you know?
This is a setup, Kent.
It is.
You're asking me before the election, and you're going to publish my answer after the election.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like it's more fair that way somehow.
Gosh, I don't know. I'm one that probably has a little more confidence in our electoral system than a lot of people do, and certainly more so than a lot of the rhetoric has been recently. So I think we need to manage expectations and prepare for days or even weeks of not knowing some things. I mean, the caveat, of course, is that official tallies normally take days and sometimes weeks. It's just that there's enough confidence in votes that have been cast, say, on election day or by the day after, to speculate the winner on kind of a statistical average, right? But official counts typically are not completed until days or even after, or even weeks after. So some of this is going to be normal, but there's going to be a kind of a difference. What I'm concerned about, and this theme will come back, is kind of this difference between perception of what's going on with ballot counting in this example, and reality. So the rhetoric from both candidates and the media and kind of all the players, that's going to be one thing. And the actual tally, it's going to be really difficult for people like you and me to really understand where any given election ballot counting is as far as its credibility, just because there's going to be so much noise. There's so much distrust right now from organizations and institutions that we ought to be able to trust. That it's good. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about perception and what that can snowball into. Yeah,
exactly. Now, are you saying even under more normal elections, which it does seem like it's been some time since we've had like normal elections, right? I mean, we got to go back into the almost the 90s for that. Yeah, what's normal? But you're saying that this idea that we declare a president late Tuesday night while still not having counted all of the ballots, this is not a new thing. This is actually a common thing.
I think it's I think it's more common than we sometimes think.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. As far as official vote for vote ballot counting,
right?
Which sometimes happens multiple times, depending upon the district, right? And this stuff happens at the district level, right? And then pushes upward. And that's every state does it a little differently, right? We've got 50 states, and by and large, there's a federal election commission and all that kind of stuff. But by and large, ballot counting and all those regulations, most of that's done at the state level. You've got 50 different varieties of that.
Right. And is the reason that we can declare a president without having counted all the votes because of the Electoral College and maybe a lot of the votes that aren't being counted, or in states that have either way that they would swing, it wouldn't change the outcome of the election? Is that why? Or it's because we are so good, our algorithms and all of this are so good at, if we get just a 20% sample, or I'm sure it's more than that, 80% of the votes are counted, and we kind of know how the last 20 are going to go, and we make an educated decision on the front end? Or how can we declare a president before we've counted the votes?
Yeah, I'm going to get a little bit out of my depth quickly on the technical stuff here, but I think it's probably a mix of both.
Okay,
so you get enough of a sense of the really important places and go from there. And it's not that they're not counted.
Yep.
Even in total, but as far as like the official, like stamped and official counts, that often doesn't happen days. Interesting. Until after the election.
So what would you put go ahead.
I was going to say, I hope for our sake that confidence in the process. I really want our nation to be united in confidence of the process.
Yes.
Because that is a big problem, one way or the other. So here, I'll confess, for the sake of our nation, and for the sake of what I said, confidence, and then the skepticism, and then the distrust. I hope whichever way it goes, it's overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's close and it's disputed, that's going to be some tense times. And so by the time folks listen to this, when you publish, we could be in for a rough ride.
Yeah. If you were guessing though, by Friday when this comes out, whether people know who's president, what would your guess be?
Who's president?
Yeah. Who's going to be?
Gosh.
Or do you just think there's a good chance we're not going to know at that point yet?
I think we should. See, I'm just not crazy about speculating.
Yeah.
About.
But you could see it go either way.
I could see it go either way.
You could see it go either way. Okay.
Yep. The polling seems to indicate that Biden had a pretty significant lead.
Oh, I'm not asking you on who you think is going to become president, because I know I'm just saying by Friday, do you think we're going to know as a nation who it is? Is it going to be Trump or is it going to be Biden? Right? That's what I'm talking about.
I think we're going to have a pretty confident answer.
Okay.
There, I'm going to stake my claim.
Yeah.
We're going to be confident that we know who the next president is by
Friday. Okay, that's interesting. So I only in the last couple of days, no, I wouldn't totally disagree with you, but I only started feeling that way in the last couple of days, honestly. I think prior to that, it was this could be months, this could be weeks and weeks. Yeah. This could really drag on. But I mean, it's down to a few, at this point, it looks like it's down to just a few kind of key states. Yeah. So.
Well, and one of the things that will matter is to the extent that there are districts where numbers look fuzzy or incomplete or questionable, right? It's going to depend on what happens everywhere else, right? It's going to depend on to what extent there is confusion or problems with ballots. Because if it happens, I don't know, if it happens in Middle Tennessee, there's
exactly.
That's a different problem than if it happens in Broward County, Florida.
That's right.
Right. If it's a district that's going to tilt the balance of where a state's electors are going to go, like that's a big deal.
Yes.
If it happens in a state, in a county where, look, Tennessee's a great cross section where we are of America. You've got Memphis, Knoxville, Middle Tennessee, Nashville. The joke when I landed here many years ago was that this is a cross section. So governance in Memphis is a little more progressive. Governance in Knoxville is more conservative, that side of the state, and then state elections are decided in Middle Tennessee. Right?
Yeah.
If you have a state that on a presidential election is going to go either red or blue, if there is a discrepancy at a district within that state, it's not, even if it matters one way or the other, right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it matters how crucial those particular districts are.
Yes.
So if you have widespread chaos, or I shouldn't be using the word chaos.
Right.
It's just inflaming and scaring people. So I retract that word. If we have discrepancies at the ballot counting.
Uncertainties.
Minor uncertainties. It matters, it's as far as like us knowing, to your question about who's going to be president on Friday, it matters whether it's, in a state like California or New York or a swing state like Florida or Ohio, right?
Yep. And I guess I was going to say obviously, but it's not obviously. But in those swing states, the race is much tighter, it seems, than nationwide. Because right now, Biden has a greater lead nationwide. But then when you narrow it down to like the 13 more key states, the lead is less. And I honestly don't really understand how polling works. Like, how do they know how people are going to vote before they vote? I mean, I understand sometimes they call people, is that right? And ask them how they're going to vote, which seems super antiquated and labor intensive and everything. Like, I'm not sure that I understand how or why polling is even supposed to be as accurate as it is, which I understand it's not always even that accurate.
Yeah.
I just don't have a good grasp on that piece.
Frankly, I don't follow it enough to be a kind of a nerd about the polling stuff, but I do know it's been more challenging in recent years.
Yeah.
Because what you had when everybody had a landline phone, you were a little more up for grabs.
Sure.
Right? But everybody's mobile, and we're also more shrewd about avoiding unknown callers with caller ID and screening and voicemail. And so it's harder to get actual voters on the phone.
Yep.
There are polling folks that are going to say, well, our program is different. We can navigate around that, but that's a real issue because you have presumably a smaller portion of the U.S. population who's willing to participate.
Exactly.
But we'll see. I mean, the polling industry every 2 years, right, is there. If you're a polling consultant, your next job is on the line. Depending upon how accurate your stuff is. Yep. How accurate your data and models are. So I don't know.
Talk about no pressure. Now, the one group of people my heart goes out to is the people at the USPS. I saw in today's Wall Street Journal that they've processed over 4.5 billion pieces of political election mail so far. 4.5 billion pieces. That's so much mail.
It's a lot.
That's more than double 2016. And that includes 122 million ballots, which that number is shocking to me. 122 million ballots, because I was of the understanding that only about 30 to 40% of the population voted anyway.
Yeah.
And here we are at 330 million Americans, give or take.
Yeah.
So that's just so many people that have voted by mail-in. It was surprising to me.
Yeah.
All right, so let's zoom back out then. So it's Monday. The election hasn't happened. You're kind of in, this space. You're looking at it obviously from a Christian worldview as well. You have some thoughts about how that Christians and Christian leaders can be viewing these things and navigating these things. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious. What are your thoughts on where we're at now? And again, if there's this 5-day delay, just keeping that in mind for the listeners. But I'm just kind of curious what you're seeing, good, bad, or indifferent with where we stand now.
Yeah. So I've been kind of in this space for about 20 years professionally. And the unique thing about Christians deciding their votes this time around, the thing that makes it unique this year, and to some extent 2016, but I think it's even more acute this year, is that a lot of Christians, I think, are making their voting decision not partly what they're for and what they want to advance, but there's kind of there's another calculation going on here, I think, for a lot of Christians, because when you look at, I think maybe we discussed in the past, kind of people who skew towards what might be labeled righteousness kinds of issues versus people who prefer and emphasize justice-related issues, which, by the way, those two words in the Bible are typically synonymous with one another. That's another in-depth conversation for a biblical scholar, but righteousness and justice are typically hinged together in our scriptures. But so you have kind of rightward leaning folks who emphasize the pro-life movement, religious liberty, those kinds of things, and then folks who tend to be leftward who want to emphasize racial justice, things like immigration reform, criminal justice reform, which is also a rightward-friendly thing, by the way. But we as Christians, we're kind of split to choose which part. Kind of the parties are forcing us to choose between biblical values that all harmonize with one another, really. It's not necessarily that Christians disagree on those issues as a principal matter, but they're calculating their importance differently. And so one of the things that's a struggle, I think, for some Christians is that if you vote for President Trump for the sake of the pro-life cause, then you may be criticized by other Christians for not caring sufficiently about justice-related, race-related issues. And if you cast a vote for Biden, you might be accused by other Christians for not caring enough about unborn.
Mm-hmm.
You might be accused of not caring enough for religious liberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, to top it all off, if you decide to take a conscientious objector position and not choose either party,
Yep.
Refrain from casting a vote in either race, not withdraw from the election and showing up at the polls, but the particular race because you object to two particular candidates. Maybe you vote third party, maybe you abstain for the sake of conscience. Then you could be accused, again, by either Christians of not caring sufficiently enough for either of those families of issues, right? Or even embracing a kind of fatalist mindset, which is kind of a withdrawal kind of mindset. And so you're calculating, to some extent, your vote based on which flack you're willing to take. Mm-hmm. Again, from within the body of Christians. And that's troubling to me. So as far as your question about where we are, I think that would be my response.
Do you think that polarization is at an all-time high in 2020, or is this just something the church has been dealing with every 4 years in America, the last couple of decades, and just, we all have kind of short-term memories. So every time the election cycle comes around again, we just feel like, oh, it's at an all-time high, when actually it's just another election cycle. Yeah. But also there does seem to be something particularly charged about this election. What do you think about that?
I think it's particularly charged. I don't think it's a new division. I don't think it's a new polarization. I think it's more exacerbated. It's more acute. We're fighting about it more. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more a revelation of what's already been around. We already disagreed on these kinds of things, but we have a situation where a particular election cycle and two very well-known candidates and two very established political parties are kind of forcing us and kind of exacerbating that split. I think the split was already there. The emphases were already there. Yeah. But it's been exaggerated now.
Yep. Do you think that as you kind of talk through the two political parties and kind of the leanings of each, it's certainly accurate. And then also, do you think that there's a stigma or a reputation kind of for each party that maybe is not always accurate when you start to look at the details? You know what I mean? Because when you look at, kind of the more right-wing, there's no question like they have not paid so much attention to some of the social justice stuff in the past, although that's changing, right? So like at some point we need to like not stereotype right or left, honestly, because I think you could look at Kamala Harris and she's on the Democratic side, which tends to be more about social justice, and yet she was locking up a lot of people in her day, So I just wonder like how much of those stereotypes are going to go away. And like, even as we look at 2024, are we going to get a better, more balanced approach from either party or both maybe? Think we're heading that direction or not necessarily?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think the question remains after Trump, whether it's this week or whether it's 4 years from now, do things return to quote unquote normal? Mm-hmm. If so, how does that happen? I don't know. Mm-hmm. That's going to depend a lot on people at the top of the parties, whether they will try to account for some kind of normalcy, or whether what they call the norm changing, the norm shifting, the norm breaking that we've seen over the last few years, whether that's going to continue, because we've kind of let the toothpaste out of the tube, and we can change the rules of the game now, and so that's just going to perpetuate.
Yes.
I think those are two pretty different paths, and I think Christians ought to be aware of that possibility, and I think it's going to, without good people playing ball in the arena, I think it's left to atrophy itself. I think it's gonna trend in the negative way, and the norm breaking is going to continue. Mm-hmm.
Do you see Christians? So my perception here is that people are sort of like getting more involved. They feel like the stakes are higher and all of this. Are you seeing the same in Christian circles, or are you seeing sort of a disgust and almost like, we just kind of want to distance ourselves from all of this?
Yeah.
Which way are you seeing the Christian, I guess the evangelical Christian community in America kind of gravitating here?
That's a good question. When you ask me that question about the evangelical community in America, I think of two fairly different churches, both of which I've been a member. I think of my church that was planted just in 2010 in Washington, D.C., that I was a member of my wife and I were members for 8 years. And we believe the same gospel, preach the same, we're part of the same denomination as my current church in Middle Tennessee. But the political leanings of each of those congregations are pretty different.
Oh, yeah?
It doesn't mean they're not aware of the emphases, right, of, say, other Christians. But there were a lot of Christians who I was fellow members of a church with in D.C. who, after the 2016 election, they didn't know anybody who voted for Trump. It was unfathomable to them that anybody would vote for Trump. And I, of course, was in a position where I know a lot of people who vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. And I think you also have a situation where it's possible that in my church, I don't know, my current church, that there are people who couldn't fathom a Biden voter.
Sure.
I think there may be a little more of a mix, but so I see those kinds of sample groups of evangelicalism. In my Tennessee church, it's a more established church. It's been around for 50, 60 years. And so they're just kind of different church cultures, even though they believe the same Bible, part of the same denomination, and would collaborate easily, on mission if given the opportunity to. I see a little bit of both. I see the hyperbole of the greatest election or the most important election of our lifetime rhetoric kind of thing, which I've seen now for at least 4 or 5 straight election cycles.
Every time it's the most important.
It's the most important, right?
Yeah.
I think even if you're going to make that case, I think you could probably qualify it with a most important election I've seen to date. Right, I've witnessed to date. So it's more backward looking.
Sure.
When you say lifetime, you're communicating that it's going to be the most important election in the future.
Right. Yeah.
And I think if you mean lifetime as to date, that's one argument. I think it's still flawed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you see that. And then I think you do see people are just, kind of checking out. I think we may have discussed this last time I was on the podcast that part of the reason we have such a polarized environment is because moderate, using for lack of a better word, Americans, they're just repelled by the polarization and the hyperbole and the nastiness of it. So what do? They withdraw. Yeah. And so, but that withdraw creates a vacuum. And so the extremists on both sides actually get a greater voice because those of us who are sane are like, I'm out.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about that last time. I think that's a real thing. And maybe it's, I don't know. Maybe I'm a product of my own environment here. I feel like the rhetoric has toned down a little bit since May, June, July. It was pretty hot this summer. I mean, not temperature-wise, just the rhetoric. It was pretty, it was very contentious.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely spending a little less time on Twitter, so maybe it's that. But I sort of feel like it's toned down a little bit. I mean, maybe I'm just optimistic, but I felt like it's not quite as triggered as it was a few months ago.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's my sense. I've probably withdrawn from social media and Twitter a little bit too. It's also possible that because early voting seems to be so high, the closer you get to the election, you kind of diminishing returns you get on rhetoric. And,
it's true.
And frankly, look, Biden's been in government for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
Trump has been a celebrity in the American eye for about the same time. They're known quantities. And so if you're talking about presidential election stuff, what more could be said, really? I mean, they're so well known.
Yes.
And there's and high participation on early voting and mail-in ballots that I wonder to some extent. But again, I'm one who doesn't watch 24/7 news media.
Yeah, agreed.
So we might not be a good cross-section to make that judgment.
Yep, that's true. All right, so let me ask you this. So what would you say to the people who wouldn't, well, first of all, just an observation. One of the things that's unique to the gospel of Jesus Christ is how multicultural and diverse and how universal it is at a cultural standpoint.
Right.
Because it's like the only religion out there, if we want to even call it a religion, where it sort of elevates specific cultures unless there's sin making up that specific culture, obviously.
Yeah.
But like, pick another religion where, if I dress in, if I wear a certain garb and now I become a believer, I don't need to change that garb,
Right.
but a lot of religions do, like you need to change what you dress and all those types of things. So that's one of the things that's, I think, unique to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is so beautiful, is because culture came from, this was a God thing. Culture came from God, diversity and all these things. It's a beautiful thing. And so it's great that we get to experience that. So that's kind of on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you would have, I think, people saying, I just can't get past how you can vote for, say, Biden because he's Democratic and they are kind of pro-abortion, I guess, So what would you say to that?
I want to back up a little bit for that question and say we got to recognize what we're doing here in an election cycle. A lot of the decisions about who we get to cast a ballot for have been decided before tomorrow, right? Before we show up with our ballot, right? So to some extent, there's a question of how much influence do we have upstream from the presidential election day.
That's a great point.
And so when you're faced with what some people call a binary option, and which is some cases true, you can always vote for independents. You can do write-ins, right? I think number one, we've so, particularly in evangelical life, for years, decades, we have so inculcated the value of participation and voting that we have established participation in voting as a moral obligation. There's a lot of truth to that, I think. I could make a case for that. But what we haven't done is kind of parse the difference between, or this tension between voting, which is maybe the most pragmatic, the most practical act that we as private citizens do as far as self-governance. It's pragmatic, right? You're picking A or B, or C or D or F or whatever. At the same time, what we haven't cultivated, so we've established a moral obligation to participate in a very pragmatic thing. What we haven't cultivated is the mix in that pragmatic decision that is conscience. We haven't really schooled that up as much to teach people, look, there's a tension here. Mm-hmm. Maybe some races, it's probably not equal, it's probably not symmetric in every race, but I think when we cast a ballot, sometimes we do it with pretty full confidence that, look, I support this person. We kind of assume, when we feel good about a candidate, we kind of assume the conscience part of it, because there's a harmonization there between the pragmatism of casting the ballot and our conscience, because we align with that. What's been weird in the Trump moment and the Trump in 2016 and now is that there's a tension here, sometimes a split, basically, between what we believe is valuable policy and versus what we find objectionable to our conscience, all wrapped up in the same administration. And so there's a discontinuity there, to put it mildly in some cases, but there's a discontinuity between what we think is, for those of us who are kind of rightward leaning on public policy issues, we've spent years, decades even, on, say, like pro-life movement, developing really tight, precise rhetoric when we talk about abortion, and how we talk about it. And we've got decades now of really professionalized pregnancy care clinics who really are highly professionalized and know how to speak to women and mothers and families who are considering abortions. And there's a lot of rhetoric you don't use. Right? It's very strategic. It's very well formed. It's very thoughtful. It's well researched. It's very loving, very rooted in Scripture. And then you have a person who now has been billed by some as the quote most pro-life president, and yet his rhetoric, either on the pro-life issue specifically or other issues that have nothing to do with abortion, you don't have that same kind of care and thoughtfulness on the rhetoric. We like the policy. We like the people he's appointed, say, even friends of mine at Health and Human Services. We like the justices, but there's a rhetorical split between, which you didn't used to have. Whether you aligned, you're speaking for someone who worked for the Southern Baptist Convention doing public policy stuff with that institution, whether it was Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Obama, you kind of, the rhetoric always matched the policy.
That's interesting. Yep.
With Trump in office, all of a sudden you have a movement, the rightward movement, social conservatives, I'll specify, where the policy and the decisions appear really good in a lot of cases, but there's a really big disconnect. Now, the disconnect, the rhetoric specifically on life issues has gotten better. He seems to have been coachable. But, there was a time where you had a president, or I forget whether he was a candidate or a president then, but he more or less affirmed that, if Roe v. Wade was overturned, that we'd be locking up post-abortive women in jail. He rescinded that.
Wow.
But that's like a big time, what would you call it? That's not at all mainstream pro-life.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Nobody ever, that's just not a thing.
Yeah, I didn't know you ever said that.
Now, there would be some, pro-life movement does support some legal consequences for abortion doctors, physicians who perform abortions. There would be criminal penalties for that. But he kind of played into the notion, and I had to go back and research it. And they rescinded it, I believe. But it was head spinning.
Yeah.
For someone who's been in the pro-life movement for a really long time to be like, this is not a thing, and you're kind of playing into the caricature of the pro-life movement from the pro-abortion industry. Yeah. So there were moments like that. It's just there's this tension. Yeah. So I'm getting well away from your original question. Yeah. But I think those of us who emphasize, say, pro-life stuff, religious liberty stuff, judges, we're looking at it through a lens that's very policy oriented. It's very pragmatic. It's we view it as hiring a CEO to do the mechanics of government, right? Which I think it's accurate. It's literally the executive branch. That's what we call it. He's not a king. Yep. He's not an emperor, or she, if a lady gets elected. At the same time, voters historically in America, we tend to lump a lot more than just CEO responsibilities into the presidency. My former boss, Richard Land, used to talk about, kind of make this contrast between the UK and America, where the UK, regardless of who's prime minister, you always have the Queen as kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of the mascot or kind of national identity, right? And so there's a certain amount of cultural value and ethos associated with the Queen and all of that the UK Prime Minister doesn't have that baggage as much. Sure. Right? Yep. In America, we don't have royalty. Yeah. Thank goodness. Yeah. To be clear. But we still kind of, as humans, right? Israel wanted a king, right? We still kind of place that national identity. There's kind of an association of, this is the person who's representing our nation, and it's more, it's a little more esoteric. It's a little more transcendental, maybe. Yep. But I think there's people value that either consciously or consciously, and when you have a person like President Trump in that office, they really don't like that. And now people kind of on my rightward tribe, they're going to come back and say they're going to try to make some rational arguments against why, say, voting for a pro-life candidate or someone who's at least friendly to the pro-life cause, even in a transactional way, is going to save, say, X number of unborn babies' lives. Yep. And that's the conflict we're in.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really hard to weigh those metrics against one another. And I think we ought to be gracious to each other about how we weigh those.
And so maybe one of the arguments for someone who in a clean conscience would, and is a born again believer who believes in gospel of Jesus Christ would vote for Biden, is because it's not quite as clean as you get Biden in, abortion still happens, you vote in Trump, abortion stops immediately, right? I mean, that's sort of obvious.
Right. Yeah.
But so then it becomes more nuanced, and it becomes, a little bit more, then you're looking at other policy and other motives for why you would vote. So is that fair? Is that why, plenty of believers will vote Biden and feel fine about it at a conscious level?
Yeah, I think so.
Even though they wouldn't, well, I guess I'm assuming that they would still be pro-life. I don't know. Is that it?
I think what I really care more about when I'm talking to Christians and how they're casting their vote, I care more about why we're casting our vote in a particular way. I think so. When I talk to friends on the left who are going to vote for Biden and think that it's unchristian to vote for President Trump, I'm in a position of defending Trump voters.
Yep.
For a number of reasons, we don't have to get into them, but I think there are. I'm not compelled to cast a vote for those reasons necessarily.
Yep.
But I would defend them,
Sure.
or say there's a thing that you need to consider. They're rational reasons why folks, especially in 2016, felt compelled to cast a vote for him. And frankly, in a much different way than I anticipated, he delivered on a lot of pro-life things. I have my other critiques of the administration, but there's reason. There are reasons there that aren't lumped up in the worst of what progressive may think about Trump voters. In the same way, I'm in a position of defending my progressive friends to my conservative Trump voter friends.
Sure.
To be like, look, these things are of value too.
Right.
And I don't see how we can discount them. And it's not like you can put things on a ledger.
Right.
And really compare these two. Like, people are going to feel more strongly about certain things. I just think they're they're different categories.
Yeah.
Like, I might be swayed by one or the other, but if we're talking about Christians participating in a liberal democracy and self-governance, like, I got to cut some slack to people who disagree with me.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about this country, right? Is we can have variants of opinion, and we can talk it out openly and have that freedom of speech and have civil disagreement. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing. Can we talk about, were you going to mention something there, or can we talk about some of the articles?
Yeah, we can talk about some of the articles. I just want to put one more statement here is the debate about what we're doing on this particular election day. Whatever happens this week, and whoever's inaugurated or re-inaugurated in a few months, we need to reckon that we have, I think, the more compelling question than who are we voting for this week is, what are we going to do starting after Election Day to each, respectively, whether we're more in the Republican camp or more in the Democrat camp, to work to reform each of those political parties where they conflict with biblical values? That's the more interesting question.
Yeah, that is the more interesting question, and it's the more relevant question.
Yeah.
Because that's where we can change the world, so to speak, right? Or, start here and change America. I mean, that is the question. So, you don't need to talk about the articles right now, because I feel like there's more to jump in there on that point. So, do you have thoughts on how people, no matter if it's Trump or it's Biden, or it's for some, Kanye West, which is unlikely, but Trump or Biden, going forward, whoever you voted for, how can we work to reform, bring more of the kingdom of God into those political parties? Do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I think, number one, it's a long game. This is not something that is going to turn around in an election cycle or two. American politics is a long game. I think the best metaphor, the sports metaphor, like I agree with Obama when he answered Jerry Seinfeld's question on this a few years ago, which sports metaphor is the best for politics? Obama said football. And I agree, although for a few different reasons. Obama's description was accurate, but basically you got to think of football or American politics like a football game with no clock. The clock never ends, right? You've got different you've got different teams competing against one another. I would actually the metaphor would not be Republicans against Democrats. The metaphor is issue position versus issue position, and that's going to be different, right? So you've got pro-life, pro-choice on one playing field. You've got immigration reform and border security on the one, and that battle is going to play out in one way. The pro-life issue is going to play out in a different way. Both teams are trying to get to their respective end zones, that kind of thing. But the clock never ends. You might have one side that wins something like a Supreme Court battle that looks like a touchdown, right? And so this is it's just ongoing. So that's part of why I object to the most important election of my lifetime, because this stuff never ends. I heard the same kind of rhetoric during 2008 when Obama was running and then won, and then during 2012 when Obama was running and then won, and then who knew? We got President Trump. Who would have predicted? Yeah, nobody would have predicted the rise of, whether you want to describe it positively or negatively. Who would have thought in 2008 a wave like supported President Trump and then gave the Republicans 2 years of unified government? If you thought that Obama, as progressive as his administration was, if you thought and predicted that from 2008 or 2012 that this is going to be the result for 2016 and beyond, nobody predicted that. So I'm just saying we need to hold our future predictions more lightly and understand that it's an ongoing process, and that presidential election day is both, we tend to view it as like the capstone or the cornerstone of our self-governing participation. And for a lot of us it is. Look, we've got families to raise, kids to take to gymnastics and soccer and all that kind of stuff. And like our engagement of self-governance is very low for most of us, right? You and I pay attention to this stuff more than a lot of people. I'm a nerd about it, obviously. So we got to cut some people some slack. But to the extent that if both people who think Christians ought to vote for Biden or people who think Christians ought to vote for Trump, if you dislike the choice that we have, if you dislike the fact that we're arguing among Christians, I think the onus on us is to realize that controlling the levers of government is not the only objective here. We got to be controlling the levers of the parties who are giving us these options. And we got to bring those parties closer together for the sake of biblical values, right? Because right now we're in a situation where, frankly, we're being taken advantage of. Whether you're on the right or the left, you have a political party who's trying to drive a wedge between Christians. Political parties, even when they're most aligned. Let's say I'm a believer and you have a political party who is most aligned with my values. The political party does not bear the responsibility that you and I do as members of and representatives of Christ's kingdom. Right. Whether you're talking about local church as an institution or individuals, Christians living in the public square, we have a different obligation that political parties don't have, for good or ill. And I think when we kind of engage for the sake of getting our party to win, it's part of the game. It's part of self-governance. But if that's our only objection, and we're not working between elections to reform the parties, we're going to keep getting these kinds of results.
Yes, if that's our only objective. You said objection, but I think you meant objective. Is that right? Yeah. That's such a strong point. I totally agree with that. Now, you had on your Twitter, I noticed this.
He's following my Twitter feed.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do. At MT Hawk, Matt Hawkins. Pastors/elders and other religious leaders contemplating campaign endorsement should consider a few things. This is a thread. Number one, meaningful policy influence by your institution will be muted for the duration of the next term if the opposition wins. Then you have about 7 more points, which are all very good points, by the way.
It started out as like 4 or 5. And
Yeah.
It was like, 7.
No, this is very helpful. I recommend people check this out. But this idea of your influence will be muted if the opposition wins. I thought that was an interesting point that maybe we're not thinking about so much. But then plenty would also say to that, yeah, I hear you. It's just you got to speak up for what you believe somewhere and start somewhere, right? So
Sure.
are you, this leads into, I wanted to get your thoughts on the article that John Piper put out, Wade and Grudem's response to that, and then also Albert Mueller's, Mueller's article. They all came out within like a few days of each other. But before we get into that,
sure.
Are you sort of opposed to, say, religious leaders sort of endorsing a candidate, or are you open to it as long as it's kind of fleshed out properly? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a great question. I'm glad you asked. I am for religious leaders and even religious institutions playing a greater role in communicating moral values and obligations in the public square. I am for religious leaders and institutions being more vocal in the civic space for the sake of wise public policy than I think we typically see now. I think there are models for that. So it's not a less religion in the public square.
Mm-hmm.
It's a more but differently. Do
Okay.
it. What I want to see is differently. Okay. And so what you see on what I frankly view endorsements as kind of an antiquated mode of participation, especially for the sake of religious leaders. It's so in the American water as this is what you do. If you want to play in the political arena, you endorse people, and presumably those endorsements will lead to things that you want to happen. Political endorsements benefit the political party and the candidate. They do. It is a tool of political parties. It's part of playing the game. I think religious leaders, pastors specifically, kind of within our Christian tribe and elders, I think they ought to refrain from endorsements. I think they ought to participate in shaping public policy, but endorsements are just one tool that are available to pastors and religious leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tool that's defined by the political parties. So I object to it because it's not necessary. You can, endorsements is a power play. Look, political candidates and parties care about religious leader endorsements for 2 things. Number 1, just like they care about any endorsement, head count. They're presuming that a religious leader has X number of followers, either in the pews or if you're head of an institution, even orbit of influence. You have a platform.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about leverage influence.
It's leverage influence. Yeah. It's if they can get you, it's easier than getting the 200, 300, 500, 700,000, whatever individuals that are in your orbit.
Sure,
it's cost effective for a political party and a candidate to get your endorsement as a religious leader. So just understand that. Number 2 is moral authority. Number and moral authority. And look, if you want to lend the moral credibility from the position of pastor, for which we recognize holds different obligations and different responsibilities, we might even say a higher office than political partying, then we got to be really careful how we wield that moral authority.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say never endorse a candidate, but I'm like 99% don't do it.
Interesting.
The reason I say I want to leave a little bit of a window open is because I think in terms of majority or minority cultures within a liberal democracy, say African Americans, and I think back to the Jim Crow era, when you have clearly established systematic racism implemented in law for decades. You could go back to slavery, obviously, but even more, a little more contemporary, Jim Crow. Look, if my African American brothers and sisters feel like they need to endorse a candidate for the sake of getting support to achieve a policy end, namely civil rights,
Right.
I'm not going to say no. I'm not going to say don't do that.
Yep.
But those are really particularly now. I can anticipate someone coming back and say, "Well, the pro-life issue, the unborn, is as big a deal." Maybe I'm willing to cede that if you want to rationalize it that way, but I also don't think it's necessary in our current moment. When we see this in DC. Part of it is I'm at an advantage because I've seen how stuff function in D.C. And so you have national offices like the Southern Baptist Convention, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Seventh-day Adventists, Methodists. There's some Jewish groups, some Muslim groups. They're all religious organizations participating in public policy influence and making. They're all 501c nonprofits. None of them endorse political candidates, and yet they have a place at the table. They're part of the coalition. They're part of the policy making. What's involved there? It's relationship building. It's some element of professional understanding of the environment and what to do and what not to do. It's a kind of, you could look at it through a missiologist lens. If I'm going to be a missionary in a foreign country, I'm going to learn the language, going to learn the culture, learn about how things work. If I'm going to Washington D.C., there's a language and a culture that you need to learn,
that's
right?
interesting.
Same thing at the state level. If we're in Nashville, Tennessee, state capital is not far away. You could influence policy by building relationships and being at the table. And so, to one of the points on my tweet thread is that if you play the endorsement game and the other party wins, where's your seat at the table?
Mm-hmm.
So people talk about endorsements in a pragmatic fashion. I'm saying be more pragmatic.
Yeah, even more pragmatic. Yeah, that's interesting. When it strikes me that you do have this inside perspective that most of the population does not, which is you saw how effective it was when these groups came to the table and discussed things and created policy or influenced policy, based on their perspectives and how effective that could be.
Yeah.
But see, that's not on a lot of people's radar.
Right.
So I think what's on a lot of people's radar is sort of like, whoever you're electing for president, and then they're going to make all the decisions. It's just not how it works.
Yeah.
So whose ear did you have in those policy meetings? Was it congressmen? Yeah. Specifically senators or? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the context. So
sure.
in the context of, we call it government relations, or you could call it policy advocacy. Look, it depends on the objective. Sometimes the objective is legislation, in which case you're meeting, most of the time you're meeting with staffers. It depends along in the process who you're meeting with. It could be junior staffers, and initially it could be senior staffers, and then ultimately sometimes you want a meeting with the member in some form or fashion. But frankly, most work gets done without ever meeting with members.
Sure.
You get the ear of their senior advisors, right, and their staff, and that's who the members are talking to.
Yeah.
Meeting with members most often, not always, most often, meetings with members are more ceremonial.
Yeah.
I'm going to say.
Makes sense.
There are some things now, if you're meeting with kind of core members who are going to be who they're kind of going to be quarterbacking the particular issue, if they're sponsoring the legislation, those member meetings are more important. But it could also be executive branch folks who are doing rulemaking and that kind of thing. And so it depends on the policy objective. It depends on what's necessary.
Okay. So if there's a pastor or an elder, or to use the broad term, religious leader listening to this, and they say, man, that makes sense to me. I want to become more involved shaping policy. Yeah. And man, I was just going to come out on social media or something and endorse someone. I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to go play the long game, which makes sense. It's more holistic. It seems like it's going to enact better long-term change. That way, no matter who is president, this policy is heading in the right direction. Yeah. Where can they get started?
I think you need to get to know some other like-minded pastors and, frankly, other religious leaders, maybe not even Christians, and you need to build some relationships and build some trust and say, look, this is where I'm at. I'm pastoring a church. I think if you agree with me, I think that churches ought to have a voice in the public square, but not in a way that's got to be on our terms, not in a way that forces us to play ball in the electoral political arena, but one where we know what's going on in our state, say, for example, state capital. And then see if you can get a few people together who feel the same way. And then I think you're looking to find some expertise. You're asking for people in your community because pastors don't need to be carrying the ball on this stuff, right?
Right.
You've got enough stuff in any given church to do. I think you're looking at building relationships with people you can trust who have your interest at heart. When I say your interest, I mean the reputation of your church, the mission and witness of your church. And if you get a sense that people don't care about that, then don't go too far along the path on that.
Yes.
What I'm looking for, what happened in DC is you had a situation where you had coalitions. Now, in the advocacy space, everybody kind of wants to have the brick and mortar coalition that's completely funded and it's an umbrella group for everybody. You got to speak, and like when we speak, it speaks for everybody. You're thinking like alcohol, tobacco, firearms. You're thinking the milk industry. You're thinking like farming industry, like all these kind of big lobbying names, right? Yep. Most of the work in DC that happens are actually what you'd call ad hoc coalitions. They're loose associations. They're just casual partnerships of organizations who have a shared interest in a policy goal. And then so they convene to say, we're going to work, who do we need at the table to get X, Y, or Z done? And that's going to happen at the state and local level also, or could. I don't think it happens much at the local level. I think this is kind of it's an advanced advocacy playbook, frankly. But I don't think it's anything that local churches and ministries and institutions can't participate in. Yeah. I think they ought to more often. And I think if you could find some people who are involved in government, who maybe some local think tanks, maybe some local advocacy groups, you gotta be real careful about this because again, your role, I think, as a church pastor and elder, you're protecting the mission of the church. You want to engage, but you want to do it on your terms. And so you got to build some trust, and you got to build a lot of the trust building with in the policymaking context is knowing who to trust, who you can call for accurate, credible, what you could call intel, right? But information, what's really going on. And those relationships take a little bit of time to develop. Yeah. Really, it's nothing that couldn't happen for a local church. We partnered frequently on the international religious freedom issue, which makes for the most interesting and sometimes awkward coalition because I, as a Baptist, could not partner in a formal way, right, with an organization who is Buddhist or Muslim, right? But if we agree collectively, even with atheists I had meetings with and collaborated with, we agree that people getting their heads lopped off on a beach for their religion is an evil thing. And, by the way, the U.S. government has some force and some power in the world, in some cases, to facilitate and influence nations and even non-governmental actors, terrorists, that kind of thing, for the sake of freedom of conscience, for the sake of religious freedom, for the sake of people not getting murdered or abused or raped for their religion, right? These things we agree on. So we could advance and collaborate together, not because we believe the same thing, but because we agreed and decided to partner with each other for the sake of something good. Yes. Right? I think Christians, pastors, and Christian institutions ought to have a looser framework for that. Know that it's possible. It's possible for me to sit in a room with Jewish folks, Muslim folks, Hindus, atheists, and not compromise anything about what I believe. Come to the table fully as my evangelical Christian, even politically conservative self, and sit across the table and say, hey guys, we think you guys all agree on this. Can we work together in some form or fashion? Yes. That is in no way watering down the gospel. If anything, it's a witness for the gospel.
Yeah, certainly. Yep.
And I think there are ways to go about participation that don't require endorsement.
Yep. I love that. Thanks for sharing that. All right, let's talk about the articles. Andrew, can you pull them up? So we had John Piper wrote an article, which I'll get the title up, Policies, Persons, and Paths to Ruin. That came out on October the 22nd. And then I think it was October the 26th. Maybe I have this date wrong. Wayne Grudem wrote a response to John Piper's article. And is there a date on there, Andrew? October the 27th. Yep.
Pretty close.
And then I think it was Wayne Grudem wrote the response to Piper. It says the title was A Respectful Response to My Friend John Piper About Voting for Trump. It's just so great. I love when these guys kind of have a viewpoint and then someone else has a viewpoint. I just love that. And then Albert Mohler had an article that came out. I think that one was on the 26th, which was kind of in between there, but it wasn't a response to either one. And so what are your thoughts? I thought that, first of all, I'm really glad that each of these three guys wrote those articles. I found it helpful. I found each of them to be well reasoned. I mean, what do you expect, from Piper and Grudem and Mohler?
All three of whom have been extremely influential in my own life,
really,
in my parents' life, in my wife's life.
Yeah,
put that marker down. All three of them. Yes.
Yep. I mean, most the same for me, even though I'm more familiar with Piper and Grudem.
Sure.
I have, as I read through them, it was informational for me. It was instructive to me. It was encouraging. I mean, and I have kind of my own thoughts on it a little bit. And I will say, these guys, all three of these guys are they're so far advanced from me by age and experience and theological robustness and the ability to rationalize and conceptualize and put thoughts on paper. So it's I even sort of feel bad even having any thoughts on these because these guys are I look up to them so much, but I'd love to get your thoughts. So we had the Piper article that came out first. We can kind of touch on that one. And then Grudem's response. I'd love to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah. So like you, I respect all three. I only know one of them personally. I'm not going to say who. And so I agree with, I think maybe one of the most important paragraphs, especially in Grudem's stuff, and maybe across all of them, is one of Grudem's closing paragraphs. Finally, just as John Piper in his article modeled respect for those who have another position, so I also respect him for the courage and clarity of his convictions and for his characteristic willingness to advocate a potentially unpopular position because he thinks it is right. Mm-hmm. I hope that in what I have written here, I have modeled a way to disagree with a friend graciously and in a way that will not damage our friendship in the future. Mm-hmm. He continues with a P.S., Grudem speaking again. After I finished writing this article, I sent it to John for any comments. He replied that I had represented him fairly, which we as Christians often do not do when discussing politics, as an aside. And Piper assured Grudem that, quote, he counted me as a dear friend. He also pointed out how I could make one of my arguments stronger.
Yeah, I love that.
That, I think, only someone with a strong confidence in the sovereignty of God over all history would do that in the midst of a serious disagreement about the future of the nation. I think those are the two most important paragraphs of all of this.
Yes.
Okay. Done. That's my comment.
Let me say this about Piper's article, though, which I so appreciated. And it's just so Piper. Piper has this way of, when you read his stuff or you listen to a sermon, he just has this way of drawing your heart towards Christ. I mean, that's just, he just has a knack for that. And here's this article, most of which I totally agree with and some of which I have some questions about, but still, when you read the article, you come away from this with a being drawn towards Christ, basically, which I just so admire that with John Piper's ability. And I think it just comes out of his own passion for Christ.
Yeah, I agree. Piper's always pressing that direction. I appreciate the disagreeing graciously in public. I do notice an asymmetry particularly between Grudem and Piper in, say, word count. So this is not the first pro-Trump document that Grudem has placed.
Oh, okay.
This is the latest in a series, basically.
Interesting.
World Magazine published a case for, case against Donald Trump several weeks back. Grudem was the case for, and David French was the case against. And it wasn't an article, it wasn't an op-ed. It was an interview by Marvin Olasky, editor-in-chief of World, with each of them. It was a printed interview.
Yeah. And after this, you need to send me that link because I'd love to see that. Because David French is someone I follow a lot too, and he's pretty vocal about his anti-Trumpness.
Yeah. So the affirmation of Trump. All it's to say, like, Piper didn't start all this. We've now come through 3 or 4 years now of evangelicals arguing over Trump, either for or against. So Piper's not speaking into a vacuum, but I take him at his word, where he says he's offering his thoughts for a case or some arguments that he doesn't see being lifted up or being amplified, and he felt compelled to do that. I think that's a great reason to engage the public squares when you see that something that you believe in or want to see enunciated is not being enunciated by someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you want to amplify that or contribute to the conversation. And sometimes, frankly, it takes someone with relatively equal credentials to someone compared to, say, Mueller or Wayne Grudem, right? I mean, I could weigh in with thoughts similar to Piper. Who cares?
Sure.
But John Piper, right? And so I appreciate his willingness to respectfully challenge some of the other thinking that's going on from people who he considers friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who clearly agree on really important issues about the gospel and about theology, even down to tertiary issues that they're in lockstep in so many things, right? And so I appreciate his willingness to do that. Kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, you were coming back around to the asymmetry of word count.
So if you look at Grudem's response to Piper, it's a lot lengthier than Piper's one-off.
Sure.
This is the only thing Piper has published is like 7 or 8. I didn't do the word count, but like 700 or 800 word op-ed, right?
Yep.
Grudem goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, he does.
And this is not the first, even this year. In 2016, let's remember, he endorsed President Trump before he rescinded his endorsement of President Trump, before he re-endorsed President Trump in a matter of a few weeks. That concerned me.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a situation where, look, Grudem includes a lot of good points in his arguments, but sometimes arguments are made stronger by leaving out the weaker arguments, and he includes arguments that I think are weak. I think the weaker arguments are, I think he has a little too much confidence in what the Trump administration has done for social conservative issues that I, as a insider, for lack of a better word, saw up close and personal, and say, look, it's behind the curtain. It's not all what you see.
Yep.
And actually, I could point to 3 or 4 significant legislative losses that the Trump administration, the White House, participated in to sink. That would have been that on issues that Grudem speaks to, particularly like, well, we'll set that aside.
Yeah,
we'll go too in the weeds. So I think Grudem makes some assumptions about how good it is.
Sure.
In some cases, Supreme Court justice is certainly really good. HHS thing's really good. There's just some other issues that it's not as robust a case as I think he thinks it is. And what kind of frustrates me about Grudem and some other folks is they haven't rescinded their earlier remarks in, say, like 98 around Bill Clinton, or even early 2000s around President Bush's oppositions, John Kerry, and who was the other guy in the primaries who lost out?
Not Gore.
Not Gore. Anyway, that character is a big issue. And so you've got a couple paragraphs from Grudem in 98 about the Clinton stuff and how important character was for national leaders. And then now he, in this piece, downplays that pretty significantly. And I don't see, maybe he's done it and I haven't seen it. That's possible. But I haven't seen like a direct explanation of that move.
Yep.
Right. And I can cite an example in Christian circles of the rhetoric move in polling. We flipped from 2011 to 2016. When asked if an elected official's character matters for public office, in 2011, it was something over 70 percentile, 71, 72%, 70% of us said, yes, it's important. In 2016, we completely reversed our answers and 72% of us said, no, it doesn't. In a matter of 6 years.
Who was polled? Evangelical Christians or no? Just America?
This is Evangelical Christians, and this polling was done
It is
by,
Evangelical Christians that were polled, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
White evangelicals were polled.
Interesting.
And I think this was done by, this was either Barna, I'll find it here in a minute. It was either Barna or Lifeway. So it's not like a polling group outside of our tribe. These are people who actually think you're actually an evangelical instead of some kind of like, you've been to church sometime in your life and you happen to be white and you're an evangelical. You claim a Christian. Like these polling groups actually care. And so that.
And just to be clear, they're going after a very particular demographic. You don't have to be white to be evangelical, right?
Right. You don't have to. Right. I mean, this is people. We're people who care about the definition of evangelical. Yeah. And so a lot of the polling from secular groups, and you can refer to folks like historians like Thomas Kidd and even Joe Carter at the Gospel Coalition, who've explained why polling on evangelicals is often terrible. Right. That's a conversation for another time. But it's often the way they get to you as a quote white evangelical is often not based on doctrine. Right. And often doesn't even include churchgoers. Right. So you've got polling people who are showing up on polls as quote white evangelicals who actually don't attend church on any regular basis. And yet they're rolled up in this white evangelical polling data. The polls I'm mentioning for the sake of this conversation are actual Christian polling organizations, either Barna or Data or Lifeway, who actually have some metrics to questions to gauge belief-wise, conviction-wise, doctrinal-wise, if you're an evangelical. And those qualified evangelicals flipped on that question. And I see a lot of Grudem's position on that as an example of kind of iterating that.
Yes. Now, and by the way, Andrew, so I read the title on Piper, Policies, Persons, and Paths to Ruin, Pondering the Implications of the 2020 Election. And then Wayne Grudem's article is going to be pretty easy for people to find because they can just search Wayne Grudem's response too. And I think I already read that title. And what is Albert Mohler's Christians, Conscience, and the Looming 2020 Election? Okay, so let me ask you this then, Matt. Mohler makes a point in here that basically character is policy and policy is character. Like it's harder to separate the two of them. And I haven't read that much. I don't know if I totally agree with it. I sort of see his point. What do you think about that then?
Say that again, sorry.
He just makes the point that it's difficult to separate character from policy, and your character dictates policy, essentially, was one of Mohler's points. Then what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's right. I think it's complex, to be sure. We, as evangelicals, I know people who, when folks like Newt Gingrich and Giuliani were primary candidates or considering runs for office, there were evangelical leaders who were quite vocal that if a man will lie to his wife, he'll lie to you. And that was a no-go. That was eliminating those people from the chance of an evangelical endorsement. And all of a sudden, with Trump, it's a different story. And I think, look, I'm sympathetic if you're going to make an argument to vote for someone like Trump, acknowledging that there's a disconnect between what we've traditionally believed and asserted about evangelical issues, and you say, look, this is the choice I have in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna steer towards policies that I think are better under a Trump administration than would be under a Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging all the baggage that comes along with Trump, but I'm gonna make a tough but pragmatic decision here.
Yeah.
I might not be able to go there, but I respect it.
Yeah.
What I can't understand is like the downplaying and the complete like not wanting to talk about the problems with the Trump and the character issue, right?
I totally agree with that. I find that less common, but it's like the hardcore Trumpers would go there. It's definitely there.
And to be fair, like I haven't seen it as much, but I've also early like 2016, 2017, I also kind of, so when we talked about social media, like shaping, like I've kind of intentionally withdrew to paying attention to those kinds of people.
Yes.
And
I agree.
Look, what frustrates me about evangelicals, and I'm not attributing this, any of the gentlemen were, to be clear, I'm not attributing any of this to either Grudem or Mueller, but some of the evangelicals who are really close to the Trump administration, who want to downplay the character stuff and the character flaws, and even how he's the rhetoric of how he leads our nation. If you wanted to do that, but in the context of actually meeting with the president, when he says something that troubles our community, what I've been really disturbed about is when those evangelicals who are close to Trump, instead of behind closed doors telling Trump, this is really a problem, please change, please do something different. There's very little evidence 4 years in that really happens at any meaningful level.
Right.
Instead, the onus is to very publicly attack and shame those of us evangelicals who say, wait, this is a problem, and when a president does this, this is not okay. You ought to at least be able to leverage inside. If you've endorsed somebody, if you're playing, if you have, quote, access, use that access.
Yeah.
There's very little evidence that happens.
Yep.
In a meaningful way that changes his behavior.
Yep.
And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. I don't disagree. So let me ask you this then. If you're going to lie to your wife, we have no reason to believe you're not going to lie to us, is kind of the one thing you mentioned with one of the past candidates. And then also I think you could say if you lie to us, you lie to us, which Biden has lied to us. And so this is where, let me ask you this then. Piper's argument sort of pits bad character, good policies against bad policies, good character.
Yeah.
And I would be the first to say that Trump's character is not explicitly Christian, and in some ways. And the best thing you could probably do, at least to get like some of the segment of people on board with him, is like to stay off of Twitter and to stop saying crazy stuff. And so I agree with all that. Also, he's very just candid and honest and out there and just says it, right? And then the media has portrayed him as in some ways, worse than he actually is.
Sure.
It's like you hear that this is like the worst thing, and then you go to look at the clip, and you're like, well, that's not as bad as I thought that it was going to be. Now I'm sort of disappointed because I thought this was going to be really great.
I thought this was going to be scandalous.
Exactly.
And it was like,
yeah, that's right. So I guess I sort of take issue with the idea that we have bad character, good policies pitted against bad policies, good character. I'm just not sure that we have good character. Well, quite frankly, I'm not sure that we have good character on either side.
Yeah.
And that sort of then takes the legs out of Piper's arguments a little bit. Would you agree with that? And what are your thoughts on that then?
Yeah, what I think is going on here is we're making calculations. We're making value judgments in a mess of a situation where neither candidate is really great.
I agree with that 100%.
Now, look, I'm not a pro-Biden person by any stretch. I do think, as far as generally speaking, I disagree with his policy positions. I published stuff over a year ago about how disappointed I was he dropped his support of the Hyde Amendment, which is a kind of a pro-life, pro-choice scrimmage line at the federal government. Pretty terrible. The Democratic Party has, even when it's been in their electoral interest, when it's been in their political interest to moderate on the abortion issue, they haven't done it. They've dug down based on probably largely their financial support from the abortion industry. Even when it's in their political interest, they've doubled down and gone further, which is really why I think President Trump won so much support from pro-life evangelicals in 2016. Was he was the one guy in the context of a presidential debate to go after Hillary Clinton on this issue, and she doubled down, and he kind of really aggressively argued. I think it was like the third debate that year. And evangelicals and pro-life folks had never seen any presidential candidate of the Republican Party even be that vocal at that level, at that kind of political high-profile moment. He won a lot of support then. I just wish we'd kind of. I think we're making arguments and evaluations that neither of which especially when you're arguing for policy against, I'll say it this way succinctly. I think we're looking at consequentialist decisions and we're trying to bless it with morality, or bless it with a biblical, this is the way Christian ought to vote. Even if they don't say it outright. Sure. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
Valid point. I want to say like valid point. Let's be cautious to kind of bless those with the Christian view of things.
Yeah.
And as much as I respect all of these gentlemen who are weighing in publicly and bringing credible content to bear on this debate, their positions and how they enunciate them is less important to me than people who will pick one and say, see, my guy endorsed my position. Even though all of them have said, this is a matter of conscience, people are going to disagree with me. That's what I'm concerned about. It's kind of the, this is not the only issue we see this, but kind of the Christian celebrity kind of thing where we kind of want to glob on to. Pastors see this all the time too. Hey, did you hear the podcast by celebrity pastor so-and-so? The local pastor's like, did you listen to my sermon this week?
Right. Yeah.
So there's kind of we kind of gravitate towards people who endorse our particular way of things. And in politics, I'm very concerned about kind of the blessing our pragmatic consequentialist arguments with holy water.
Sure. No, that makes total sense. So do you think then that I'm thinking you'd be okay with Piper's article because that was not an endorsement of a candidate. Grudem and Mohler's a little bit more were. So would your opinion be appreciate the content, good food for thought, still wish you hadn't endorsed a candidate?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, interesting.
I especially at the national level, especially for a presidential election. Again, what do candidates and parties value in an endorsement? Head count, moral blessing.
Right.
And when you endorse, and I think at the national level, unless you actually have an institution in DC or some kind of, direct relationship with the president or with the White House. And I'm saying, like, be more pragmatic. Like, who can you pick up the phone and call?
Yeah.
What specific policy do you expect to get out of this?
Yep.
Then I'm just really skeptical about the whole project.
Yep.
Because even though, Grudem's going to say he's a theologian, Mohler's the president of a seminary. Presumably, they're probably both elders. I'm actually foggy on that. Piper's been a pastor, right? They're not representing a local church specifically in the way that most of pastors would. But we see them as those kind of, you're carrying the weight of Christian institutions with you,
Yeah.
and the credibility of your office, whether it's as a theologian or a pastor.
Yep.
And that's what I'm really concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
Help people weigh all the options. Teach the controversy, definitely. But I'm really more skeptical about when you're teaching the controversy and then you kind of come down on one side and therefore vote this person.
Yeah.
I'm really skeptical about that project.
Mm-hmm.
And it's frankly something I would have done many years ago, in the pre-Trump era, pre-Trump Biden, pre-Trump Hillary Clinton. I would have been more prone to do that for the sake of pro-life Republican candidates.
I see. Yep.
But I'm really more skeptical about that process.
Yeah.
Now.
All right, we have 5 minutes because you got to go at 3, and man, we could talk a lot more about these articles. Unless there's anything you want else to pull out on it, I think I'm good there. Again, I really appreciate these 3 guys. Most familiar with Piper, less familiar with Grudem, although his systematic theology, that's that's the most I've read with him.
Yeah.
And but I also wanted to get a little bit of time to hear about the Matthew 5:9 project that you're involved with. What's going on there?
So the Matthew 5:9 project is kind of an ad hoc group of pastors and church Christian leaders who are concerned, even pre-election, that our nation is becoming polarized in a way that's really unhelpful, in a way that is unhealthy. Polarization is natural to some extent. Republicans, Democrats, we need healthy disagreement in the public square, particularly in the context of self-governance. Some polarization's okay. I'm wearing a West Virginia Mountaineer jersey today, or shirt today. I don't know who your fan is, but competitiveness is a healthy thing. In many respects. The problem is when you get to the level of toxic polarization, what a lot of researchers are calling toxic polarization, is even the stuff that even where we were polarized on, say, political issues, the stuff that really kept us together as a people, as Americans, as neighbors, kind of the glue that kind of holds us together, that stuff starts to fray.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't even agree on what the data is, what the information is, on the facts, right? Because our view of media has been so eroded. And of course, if anyone's watched The Social Dilemma recently, we now know that, we can't conceive of how our neighbor down the street or on the other side of the country views issue A, B, or C differently than we do, because the facts are so clear to us. Well, it turns out you Google an issue from where I am in Middle Tennessee, and if you Google the same words in, Los Angeles, California, we're getting different results.
Yep.
And we actually are seeing different data sets about whatever the issue is. And that stuff becomes really concerning. And so the Matthew 5:9 project recognizes that dynamic, recognizes that trend line, and tries to provide some resources and encouragement to pastors and other Christian leaders who are seeing the same things but really don't know what to do. And some of the resources Matthew 5:9 project offer are training about how to view polarization, what happens. So there's some research fields, both kind of from brain science and from organizations who have monitored and researched what happens in countries where toxic polarization occurs to the point where it ends up in civil war. And they learn what things help to stave off more negative trend lines and what things help. And so that's what Matthew 5:9 project is basically, based on Blessed are the Peacemakers from the Sermon on the Mount. And we've been collaborating for several months with them now. We released an election statement around the election, which was not endorsing a candidate.
Yep.
It was, on the other hand, doing a very simple, nonprofit, non-501c3 friendly statement about political violence and saying Christians object political violence. It's not what is acceptable from a Christian worldview, encouraging Christians to engage the political process in good faith with one another, treating neighbors as equals, and recognizing the human dignity of people who vote differently than you, and that in uncertain times we need to be cautious and not drawn into we need to not inflame the rhetoric, basically. And it's been a really encouraging project. Folks like Max Lucado and Tony Evans and Russell Moore and Pastor named A.B. Bernard and a lot of other folks have joined us to affirm, say, hey, this is a good thing. So we released that election-oriented statement about political violence, but that's not the only thing to come through Matthew 5:9 project. So if folks want more information, Matthew59.org. We're pretty easy to find.
And it's Matthew 5. It's actually like spelled out like Matthew59.org, right?
Yeah. Matthew59.org.
Okay, so they can get more information on the website there.
Yeah. One of the interesting things in the lead up, we're going to publish this after the election, but one of the things we really saw from polling data released, or survey data released just the week before the election, is that on the topic of violence, of political violence, 96% of Democrats and 97% of Republicans reject the use of political violence if their candidate loses the election. 97% don't want anything to do with political violence if their own candidate loses. That same survey group, though, thinks that people of the other party support political violence up to 50%.
Yeah, that's dangerous.
So you have, again, asymmetry of our perception and reality. And Matthew 5:9 folks and some of our partnering organizations are saying, hey, there's a difference in perception here and reality. So both folks, when surveyed, do you support political violence if your candidate loses? Overwhelmingly, 96% say no. Do you think that the person of the other party, to what extent do you think people of the other party support political violence? I think half of those people over there support political violence. That's troubling.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to get the word out on that. But that's one of the examples of ways in which Matthew 5:9 is.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure we talked about it because I know that's something that you've been involved with. So, yeah, and that is dangerous. That because when we think the other side is going to be violent, then we justify actions on our end that we would never otherwise do. So that is the key thing. All right, you got to get out of here. But final thoughts for the listeners, just in general. Hopefully by now, who knows what will be happening in the country. But just you're taking a long game. That's what I really appreciate about your approach. So just final thoughts before we let you go.
Yeah. A lot of what we've been talking here is what I would term political witness. I define political witness as whether you're talking about an individual, an institution, or kind of the broad the church in America. At whatever level you're talking about, I think political witness could be defined loosely as kind of the reputational capital we get as Christians by engaging the political space. I think one letter, one statement is not itself political witness. I think it's a tool. I look at things as tools of advancement that over time present and culminate in what I'd call political witness. And I think that's the project we're trying to reform over time. And I think there's an internal aspect to that of discipleship. We've got to reestablish some sense of pastoral, elder, church authority on the political consciences of church members. That's not a thing right now. Churches often don't have authority over their worship music style either, right? So it's not just a political thing. But we tend to want, when the pastor endorses or affirms our political disposition, we're like, yeah. And we tell all our friends. But then a pastor presents something that is a challenge to our political point of view, don't talk about politics.
Yeah.
Right? We want to have it both ways.
Yep. That or we leave.
That or we leave.
Yep.
Or we leave.
Yep.
Or we cause a stink and cause a church split or whatever. But we need to kind of not, when I say pastoral and church authority over political conscience, I'm not saying that churches or pastors ought to tell people how to vote. I am saying they ought to have, from Scripture, given their authority in our lives, they ought to have a word for us about about the attitudes that we bring into the public square. And that when we're in the public square, we're always representing the church, the kingdom of God in some form or fashion. We're doing that at our business. We're doing it at our offices. We're doing it at school. Politics is no different. We can't sever political sphere from the mission of Christianity, and from gospel mission. And so I think those are kind of some elements we need to reclaim. And I think we need to repopulate what we kind of step back from debate among Grudem and Moeller and Piper. We need to take those moments. We need to kind of step back and if this is in a category of wisdom where Scripture gives us some broad principles but doesn't tell us, all right, all the governing in Scripture is done in the context of empires and emperors and kings and kingdoms. So there are more kind of jagged lines from Scripture to our policy positions and our advocacy. But I think the case can be made that how we engage and how we advance public policy issues is as important as the ends that we seek. When our means to, say, abolish abortion conflicts with human dignity along the way, I think that's a problem. And so I think our means and methods ought to match. So we have an internal kind of a discipleship issue where we kind of need more intentional, I think, cultivation of biblical values for the sake of our consciences in the public square. And then when we step into the public square, we need to recognize that it's not just policy means, policy goals that we have in mind. There's an effectiveness, but part of effectiveness in the kingdom context is also faithfulness and a witness, because people with whom you're making policy and influencing policy, they're looking at you and recognizing a witness of the kingdom. And that's where the character stuff gets involved, because we want to get the policy wins that Grudem and Moeller want, but we also have the responsibility to advance the kingdom and be a kingdom witness, like Piper redirects us.
Yep. Matt Hawkins,
thanks.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.